My name is Cole Hargrove. I am 34 years old and I work as a veterinarian at a small mixed practice clinic in Bozeman, Montana. We handle companion animals through the week and take farm calls on weekends when the ranches outside of town need us, which they do with reliable frequency because cattle and horses do not observe the same boundaries around personal time that people in other professions are permitted to maintain. I have been at the clinic for 6 years, having completed my residency in Colorado and returned to Montana because Montana was where I understood the land and the light and the particular quality of silence that exists at altitude in the early morning when the work has not yet started and the day is still entirely possibility. I am the younger of two brothers. My brother's name is Reed. He is 3 years older than me, which makes him 37, and he is in commercial real estate in Denver, which suits him in the way that certain environments suit certain people. Not because Denver or commercial real estate are objectively superior to other places and occupations, but because Reed has always moved best in rooms where the primary currency is confidence and presentation, and Denver commercial real estate is a room of that description. He is not a bad man. I want to be precise about that because this story involves him in ways that require fairness to all of its participants. Reed is not a bad man. He is a man who wants things and pursues them with the particular single-mindedness of someone who has always found that wanting something hard enough eventually produces the thing, and who has not yet fully reckoned with the costs that method incurs. Her name was Audrey Callahan. She was my girlfriend for 2 years, from the spring of my first year at the clinic until the autumn of my third. She was a high school English teacher in Bozeman, intelligent and warm, and the kind of person who moved through the world with a generosity that was not performed but was simply structural. The way she was built, the natural expression of how she engaged with things and people. I had loved her with the specific, uncomplicated clarity that I have come to understand is rare. The kind of love that does not require maintenance or management, but simply exists as a condition of being in someone's presence, the way certain altitudes exist as a condition of certain landscapes. She had come to Christmas at my family's house in Billings in December of our second year together, and Reed had been there, and I had watched him apply to Audrey the full force of his attention in the way he applied himself to things he decided were worth his effort. I had told myself it was simply how Reed was in social situations, expansive, focused, interested. I had told myself Audrey was too perceptive to be managed by it. I had told myself a number of things that were convenient rather than accurate, and by February she had ended the relationship with me with the honesty and the kindness she brought to everything, and by April she and Reed were together, and by the following December they were engaged. I will not narrate the full interior experience of those 14 months because this story is not about bitterness, and I am not a bitter man. What I will say is that I learned in those 14 months the specific and durable lesson that you cannot build a life on the avoidance of truths you find inconvenient. I had known, in the months after Audrey ended things, that the ending had not come from nothing. That something had shifted at Christmas in Billings, and I had chosen not to address it directly because addressing it directly would have required me to have a conversation with my brother that I did not want to have. That avoidance had been a choice, and choices of that variety have costs that arrive later and with interest. I went to the wedding. I want to be clear about this because it matters. I went because Audrey and I had ended with honesty between us, and I did not carry ill will toward her, because Reed was my brother regardless of the history, and because not going would have been a statement I was not prepared to make publicly. I drove from Bozeman to Denver on a Friday in late June, checked into the hotel the wedding block had reserved, put on the suit I had bought for the occasion, and sat in the third row of a venue on the outskirts of the city and watched my brother marry the woman I had loved. The ceremony was at 4 in the afternoon. The reception ran until 11. I left at 9:30, having stayed long enough to fulfill every reasonable obligation, and drove back to the hotel and sat on the edge of the bed with my jacket off and my tie loosened, and the particular quality of exhaustion that belongs not to the body, but to the sustained effort of being present and composed in circumstances that cost something. My phone rang at 11:17. The name on the screen was Josephine Callahan. Jo, Audrey's younger sister. 29 years old at the time, 3 years younger than Audrey, a structural engineer at a firm in Billings who I had met half a dozen times over the course of the 2 years Audrey and I were together. We had gotten along in the easy, low-maintenance way of people who occupy adjacent positions in each other's lives, close enough to be genuinely friendly, removed enough that the friendship did not require independent cultivation. She had bright, direct eyes and a way of saying exactly what she was thinking that was not identical to Audrey's warmth, but was its own form of honesty, sharper-edged and more openly amused by the world. I answered because it was 11:17 at night and she was calling from a wedding reception, and those two facts together suggested either distress or something that needed to be said. "Cole," she said. "Joe," I said, a brief pause, the kind that has something behind it. "She married the wrong brother," she said. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed and did not say anything for a moment. "Joe," I said carefully, "how much have you had to drink?" "2 glasses of champagne and one very bad decision of a gin and tonic," she said. "I am not drunk. I am honest, which is a different thing, and tonight is the night I'm choosing to be both simultaneously." Another pause. "I have been thinking about saying this for 8 months." I did not say it because there was nothing useful in saying it while the wedding was still something that could be stopped, and everything terrible in saying it after. "But you left early, and I watched you leave, and you looked like someone who was being very correct about something that was costing him considerably. And I thought—" A pause. "I thought you should know that you are not the only person in this family who knows the thing that everyone is not saying." I looked at the wall of the hotel room for a moment. "What is it that everyone is not saying?" I said. "That Reed pursued her," she said. "Deliberately and specifically. That Audrey was not." She stopped. "Audrey is my sister and I love her, and I am not saying she made the wrong choice for the wrong reasons. I am saying that the reasons included a version of Reed that he presented for the purpose of the pursuit, and that she has not yet fully discovered is a presentation rather than a person." A pause. "And that you were the right person and the wrong brother, and that is not the same as being the wrong person." I sat with that for a long time. "Why are you telling me this tonight?" I said. "Because you are 3 hours away in a hotel room, and you drove to Denver and put on a suit and sat in the 3rd row and left at 9:30, and you did all of it correctly and quietly and without making it about yourself," she said. "And because I think you have been doing things correctly and quietly and without making them about yourself for your entire life, and I think someone should tell you that they see that." "Joe," I said, "I'm not asking you for anything," she said quickly. "I'm not saying this because I have intentions. I'm saying it because it's true and because you deserve to hear it from someone who was in the room and understood what was happening and is saying it clearly, so there is no version of tonight where you drive back to Bozeman believing that what happened 2 years ago was straightforwardly your fault." I was quiet for a long moment. "Thank you," I said finally. "You're welcome," she said. "Drive safe tomorrow." She ended the call. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed for a long time after the call ended, not with the turmoil of something newly broken, but with the particular quality of stillness that arrives when something that has been slightly wrong in your understanding of a thing is corrected, and the full picture becomes visible. Not better, exactly. More accurate. And more accurate in the end is always better than comfortable, even when the accuracy is not what you would have chosen. I drove back to Bozeman on Saturday morning. The drive from Denver to Bozeman is 11 hours if you take it directly, which I did, through Wyoming and up into Montana, the landscape opening outward in the specific way it does when you cross the state line and the scale of things changes. I thought about the phone call for most of the drive and was honest with myself about what I thought, which was that Joe Callahan had said a true thing at some personal cost and had been clear that it was not an invitation, and that I was going to take it for exactly what it was, the generous and honest act of a person who had decided that the truth was owed, and not construct anything additional from it. I returned to the clinic on Monday. I worked. I did the farm calls on the weekend and the companion animals through the week, and I let the months do what months do when you allow them to, which is to put distance between you and the acute version of something until what remains is the durable understanding rather than the immediate wait. Joe and I did not speak for 4 months after the wedding call. We were not avoiding each other. There was simply no infrastructure for regular contact between us. She was in Billings. I was in Bozeman. We were connected through a family system that now had a different shape than it had 2 years prior, and navigating that shape required the careful attention that reorganized families always require. In October, she called again. Saturday morning, 9 o'clock, which was a reasonable hour, and told me this was not an impulsive call. "I'm coming through Bozeman on Thursday," she said. "I have a site visit in Livingston Friday morning, and I'm driving from Billings. If you want to have dinner Thursday night, that would be, I'd like that." I noted the revision in that sentence, the shift from the impersonal to the direct, "I'd like that." "Yes," I said, "I'd like that too." She arrived Thursday at 6:30. I had made dinner at my house because a restaurant felt like a performance of an occasion, and what I wanted was the actual occasion, which was 2 people sitting across from each other, and having a real conversation without the architecture of a public setting around it. She came to the door in work clothes that she had not changed out of, a fleece over a collared shirt, her dark hair shorter than it had been at the wedding, and she had the same bright, direct quality I remembered, the eyes that assessed things quickly and accurately, and did not pretend to have assessed them otherwise. We had dinner for 3 hours. She was a structural engineer 6 years into her practice, doing primarily commercial and some bridge work in the Billings metro area and eastern Montana. She talked about it with the precise enthusiasm of someone who loved the specific intellectual problem at the center of their work. The question of how loads distribute through a structure, and what keeps a thing standing under the conditions it will actually face, rather than the conditions you hoped for when you designed it. She talked about a bridge project she was currently on with an animated specificity that reminded me of the way I talked about a difficult case at the clinic, not for the benefit of an audience, but because the problem itself was genuinely interesting, and the person across from her seemed genuinely interested. I was genuinely interested. She asked about the clinic with the same quality of real curiosity she had applied to the wedding call, direct questions that were looking for actual information rather than filling conversational space. She wanted to know what the farm work required that the companion animal work did not. She wanted to know what I found most difficult about the practice of veterinary medicine, not the surface answer, but the real one. I told her the real one, which was the communication problem. That the patients could not tell you where it hurt, or when it started, or how the pain presented, and that you were always working from incomplete information and behavioral evidence, and the history provided by people who were themselves often frightened and not always accurate, and that the margin for error in that condition was smaller than most people understood. And that carrying that margin every day was something that required a particular kind of attention that did not turn off when you left the clinic. She was quiet for a moment after I said this. "You are describing my job with different vocabulary," she said. "What do you mean?" I said. "I work from incomplete information and behavioral evidence, the evidence of how a material behaves under load, how a site reads in the ground survey, what the history of a bridge tells you about its current condition, and I build toward a conclusion that has to hold under conditions I cannot fully predict." She paused. "The margin for error is small and you carry it all the time." "Yes," I said. "Exactly." She looked at me across the dinner table. "I don't often meet people who understand that description from the inside," she said. "Neither do I said. We talked about the wedding call eventually. She brought it up directly, which I had expected from her, sometime in the second hour when the conversation had settled into the ease of people who have been honest with each other before and know the level of directness that is available. "I want to ask if saying what I said caused you more difficulty than it resolved," she said. "I have thought about that since June." "No," I said. "It was the right thing to say. It was accurate and it was given without expectations, and I needed the accuracy more than I needed the comfortable version." "I was not entirely without expectations," she said. "I want to be honest about that." I looked at her. "Not at the time of the call," she said. "At the time of the call, I meant exactly what I said, that you deserve to hear a true thing. But in the months since I have been aware that the call was also an introduction, that I said something true in a way that made myself known to you as a person who would say true things." A pause. "I don't know if that was calculated. I think it was honest impulse that I have since recognized also served a secondary purpose." I sat with the honesty of that for a moment. "That is a very precise self-assessment," I said. "I am a precise person," she said. "It is not always an asset socially." "It is with me," I said. She looked at me for a moment. The assessment quality in her gaze that I was beginning to understand was not judgment but the natural expression of someone who processed things accurately before responding to them. "Good," she said, simply, and returned to her dinner. The months that followed were the construction of something deliberate and honest from the correct materials. We were not careless about the context. She was Audrey's sister, and Audrey was now my sister-in-law by virtue of her marriage to Reed. And the relationship between those facts required navigation that was both straightforward and, in its specific demands, complicated. We navigated it by being honest about it rather than managing it, which was Joe's natural approach to most things, and which I was learning at 34 to adopt more consistently than I had historically managed. She came to Bozeman twice more in the fall. I drove to Billings in November. We talked on the phone with a regularity that was not discussed or agreed upon, but that simply established itself as the natural rhythm of two people who had found that the other was worth the continued attention. She was not uncomplicated. She had strong positions on structural matters, both professional and personal. and she stated them without the softening that people sometimes apply to positions they hold firmly, which meant that disagreeing with her required having an actual position rather than a managed neutrality. I found this clarifying rather than difficult, which told me something about what I needed in a person that I had not previously articulated to myself. Her wound was not loud. It revealed itself in the way of wounds that have been carried practically and without performance for a long time, in small indications, consistent and specific, that told you something durable was underneath if you were paying attention. She had been engaged once. A man named Patrick, 3 years earlier, a fellow engineer she had worked with at a previous firm. The engagement had lasted 8 months before she had ended it, clearly and finally, on the basis of a thing she described with characteristic precision. She had discovered that Patrick's version of partnership was the version in which he advanced, and she supported the advancement, and that this arrangement had been presented as mutual support and had turned out, under examination, to be unilateral in its actual structure. She had ended it without drama and had left the firm and built her practice and had not, she said, significantly regretted the decision. "The regret I carry is different," she said. "We were at my kitchen table in December, 4 months after the Thursday dinner, and the evening had reached the depth that some evenings reach when the hour is late, and the conversation has been real for long enough that the less examined things become available." "What is it?" I said. "I am precise and I am direct, and I hold things to a standard that is not always comfortable for the people around me," she said. "I know this. I have been told it with varying degrees of kindness by people who found it true. The regret I carry is the version of me that decided after Patrick that being precise and direct and standard holding was the thing that had caused the problem rather than the mismatch being the problem." She paused. "I spent 2 years being less than I was because I had incorrectly attributed the failure to my own qualities rather than to the incompatibility of those qualities with that specific person." "What changed?" I said. "I watched you at the wedding," she said. "You were correct and composed and present and entirely yourself in circumstances that required considerable effort, and no version of being entirely yourself seemed to be the problem. The problem was the circumstance. And I thought," she stopped. "I thought that if you could be precisely who you are in the middle of that particular circumstance and have it be recognizably the right thing, then perhaps the answer is not to be less precise about who you are but to find the circumstance that fits." I looked at her across the table. "You made that assessment from one evening at a wedding," I said. "I had been making it for 2 years, she said. "From every conversation we had when you were with Audrey, the wedding was the confirmation." I sat with that. "Joe," I said. "Yes, I have been careful my whole life about the wrong things," I said. "I have been careful about not making situations difficult and not having conversations that needed to be had and not addressing things directly because direct address felt like risk. And every time I chose careful over direct, it cost me something I did not fully account for until later." I paused. "I am telling you directly that I do not want to be careful in that way about this. I want to build this from the correct foundation, which means telling you that I have not been this interested in a person since Audrey, and that the nature of the interest is different in a way that matters." She looked at me for a long moment, the assessment quality in her gaze, and underneath it something that was not quite softness because softness was not her register, but was its equivalent. The thing that is structural openness rather than structural assessment. The position that receives rather than evaluates. "How is it different?" she said. "With Audrey I loved the warmth of her," I said. "The generosity, the way she moved through the world giving things to it, that was real and I don't diminish it." I paused, finding the precise language. "With you I recognize something. The precision, the direct address, the carrying of a standard that is not negotiable. I recognize it because it is close to how I am built when I am being honest about it, and I have spent most of my life believing that was a deficiency rather than a quality. You are the first person I have met who makes me understand it as the latter." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the December night was clear and cold in the specific Montana way, the sky at altitude having a depth and a density of stars that flatland skies do not produce. "That is the most accurate thing anyone has said to me in a relationship," she said. "I know," I said. "I want to be accurate with you. I think you require it, and I think I am capable of it, and I think those two things together are the correct foundation." She looked at me for another moment. Then she said, simply and with the full weight of her precision behind it, "Yes, they are." The question of Audrey and Reed was present throughout, as it was always going to be. We were not naive about it. Two families that had been adjacent were now structurally connected. Reed and I were brothers, Audrey and Joe were sisters, and the four of us occupied positions in each other's lives that could not be ignored or wished into a different configuration. We told Audrey first. Joe drove to Denver in January and told her sister directly, because that was the correct sequence and the correct method, and because Joe did not construct situations in which other people discovered important information from secondary sources. She told me about the conversation when she called that evening, not in granular detail, because some conversations belong to the people who have them, but in its essential shape, which was that Audrey had been quiet for a long time and then had said that she was not surprised and that she was not unhappy about it and that she needed some time and that she loved her sister. That was the accurate version. And accurate, as I had come to understand from the woman I was falling in love with, was always the foundation you built from. I told Reed in February, on the phone directly, because Reed was my brother and the directness was owed. The conversation was difficult in the specific way of conversations between brothers who have a history that is not entirely uncomplicated and who are both, in their different ways, careful about their own positions. Reed was quiet for longer than I expected. Then he said he understood and that he hoped it would go well for me. I believed the second part completely and the first part sufficiently, which was enough for the present and would have to be built toward over time. We went to the family Christmas in Billings in December, the first one with the new configuration. It was not uncomplicated. It was also not broken. It was a family finding the new shape of itself, which families do when they are essentially functional and willing to do the work, and this family was both. Joe sat beside me at the table and was precisely who she was, direct and unmanaged and quietly warm in the specific register she used for the people she had decided mattered to her. And I sat beside her and was precisely who I was. And what we were together in that room was not a problem to be managed, but a thing that existed and was becoming increasingly visible as a real and durable thing. 6 months after the December dinner in Bozeman, Joe took a project in Livingston, a bridge assessment for the county that was going to run 9 months, and required her to be within driving distance of the site more consistently than Billings permitted. She found an apartment in Bozeman in March, a one-bedroom in the downtown corridor, which she approached with the practical efficiency she brought to decisions she had already made correctly and did not need to examine further. She was not moving for me. I want to be precise about that because she would want me to be precise about it. She was moving because the project required it. The fact that the project was in Livingston and I was in Bozeman and the alignment of those two facts with our relationship was not accidental. She had taken the project partly because of its professional merit and partly because the proximity was sensible given the direction things were going. But the decision was hers, made on her own terms, for reasons that were professionally legitimate and personally honest, and she had not obscured either layer. She told me about the move in the same call in which she told me about the project. The bridge work is significant, she said. 9 months, county contract, good visibility for the practice. I'm taking it. And Bozeman, I said, is where you are, she said. Yes. That was the entirety of the conversation on the subject. She had assessed the structure of the situation, identified the correct load-bearing elements, and made a decision accordingly. This was how she operated, and it was one of the things I had come to trust most about her, that her decisions were made on accurate premises and stated without the management that obscures premises. We were not living together. We were in the same city, which was new, and we were learning what that meant in the daily and specific sense, the logistics of two people with demanding professional lives and strong individual requirements for the quiet and autonomy that those lives needed. She spent 3 nights a week at my house and 4 at her apartment, which was her preference and mine, and the rhythm of that arrangement had the quality of a correctly designed structure, not the maximum possible contact, which would have compromised the individual load-bearing capacity of each, but the calibrated contact that produced the conditions under which both people functioned at their best. She brought work to my kitchen table on the evening she was there, and spread it without ceremony, and worked in the focused, unperforming silence of someone who was fully present in the task without requiring management of the surrounding environment. I cooked when it was my house, and she cooked when it was hers, and neither of us made the cooking into a performance of domesticity, which meant the cooking was simply functional and occasionally excellent, and always honest about what it was. One evening in May, she was at my kitchen table with the bridge assessment drawings, and I was reviewing clinic records at the other end, and she looked up at one point and said, "The east abutment has a scour condition that was not adequately addressed in the original assessment." "What does that mean?" I said. "The foundation is being undermined by water flow," she said. "It has been happening slowly for years, and the original report noted it as a watch item rather than an action item. It is now an action item. "Can you fix it?" I said. "Yes," she said. "It requires excavation to the correct depth and proper underpinning. It is more expensive and more involved than the original scope accounted for." She paused. "But the alternative is a bridge that looks sound from the surface and is not." She returned to the drawings. I looked at her across the kitchen table in the May evening and understood that she was talking about the bridge and also telling me something about herself, and about what she had decided. This was that she was in the process of assessing the foundation carefully and addressing the conditions that required action rather than watching them, and that the work would take as long as it took and cost what it cost, and the result would be a structure that held. "Joe," I said. She looked up. "I love you," I said. She looked at me for a moment, the full, direct, unhurried gaze. "I know," she said. Then, "I love you too," and returned to the drawings in the clean and complete way of someone who has said the accurate thing and does not need to elaborate it into something more complicated than it is. The story does not end with a landmark because the most honest stories rarely do. It ends on a Saturday morning in September, 15 months after the wedding night phone call, when Joe was on my porch with the bridge drawings spread on the table and a cup of coffee from the place on Main Street, and the September light was doing what September light does in Bozeman, which is to arrive at a particular gold and horizontal angle that makes the mountains look like something that was designed rather than simply occurred. I was on the steps reviewing a case from the previous day, a cattle dog that had come in with a lameness I had not fully resolved, and that I had been turning over in my mind since Friday afternoon the way I turned unresolved cases over, with the persistent attention of someone who understands that incomplete diagnosis is a structural problem rather than a conclusion. She looked up from the drawings at one point and said, "You're still thinking about the dog?" "Yes," I said. "The gait or the imaging?" She said, "Both," I said. "The imaging is inconsistent with the gait presentation. One of them is telling me something the other isn't." "Go with the gait," she said. "The imaging gives you what it can measure. The gait gives you what the animal is actually experiencing." I looked at her. "Behavioral evidence over instrumentation when they conflict," she said. "The structure tells you what it can. What it's doing under load tells you more." I looked at the case notes for a moment. She was right. I had been trusting the imaging over the clinical presentation, and the clinical presentation was the more reliable evidence. I made a note and set the file down. "Thank you," I said. "You would have gotten there," she said, and returned to the drawings. The September morning continued around us. The mountains were present in the way they are always present in Bozeman, which is as a constant condition that you cease to consciously register, and that is nonetheless always there, holding the horizon in the specific and reliable way of things that are correctly built and correctly placed, and that have been there long enough to be trusted. Joe Callahan had called me at 11:17 at night from the wrong side of a wedding, and said a true thing at personal cost, and with no guaranteed return. And I had answered the phone and listened, and had driven back to Montana with an accuracy about my own situation that I had not possessed before the call. She had introduced herself as a person who said true things, and she had been consistent with that introduction for 15 months, and I had been learning, slowly, with the sustained attention that things worth learning require, to match that consistency with my own. I was not the version of myself that had sat in the third row of that ceremony and managed his composure at considerable cost. I was not the version that had chosen careful over direct at every available junction and accumulated the compound interest of those choices in the specific form of a life that was structurally sound and fundamentally incomplete. I was still careful, because careful was part of how I was built, and how you are built does not change entirely, it reconfigures. The care I applied now was to the correct things, to the gate over the imaging when they conflicted, to the accurate rather than the comfortable. To the woman on my porch with the bridge drawings and the direct gaze and the capacity for honesty that did not require softening to be kind. She had said she married the wrong brother, and she had been right, and the rightness of that assessment had led, by the route that honest assessments lead when they are acted upon, to a Saturday morning in September in Bozeman, Montana, where two precise and direct people were sitting in the correct light with the correct coffee, each working on a problem worth solving, each exactly who they were. Fully present in the specific and unreserved way that is only available when you have stopped building for the surface and started building for the load. The right person sometimes calls at 11:17 at night from the wrong side of a room you are no longer in. Sometimes they say the true thing because the true thing is owed, and because they have decided, in the particular way of people who do not obscure their premises, that this is the correct moment to say it. And if you answer, if you have learned, by whatever route and at whatever cost, to choose the accurate over the convenient, you will find, in the months and years that follow, that the call was not merely a consolation offered at the end of something, but an introduction to the beginning of something else. Something built correctly, something that holds.